Hi, everyone. Welcome to the next exercise adaptation or exercise change um, topic for us. So, we're going to move on to oxygen delivery and what that kind of looks like in the body and how that changes as we exercise. It's this next section is primarily a platform to discuss even in greater detail our next topic, which is blood flow. But there's some really good, important concepts covered here in this section. So, without further ado, let's look at oxygen delivery changes or adaptations. So ultimately, again, when we start exercising, one of the really important components is increasing blood flow and or getting, more importantly and specifically, oxygen delivered to cells so that we can create enough ATP for our activities. So we have an increase in blood flow during exercise, and one of the main things it does is deliver oxygen. It also takes away carbon dioxide, so that's metabolic byproduct that we make when we undergo our oxidative respiration. Additionally, if you can remember back to the last section about metabolic substrates, we also, of course, want to deliver our energy sources, glucose and triglycerides, to our cells as well, to be able to be used for anaerobic and aerobic activities. Okay. The amount of oxygen that gets delivered depends on a couple of things. The first one is essentially how demanding the tissues or working skeletal muscle or whatever our blood happens to be going by, how demanding of oxygen those tissues are, so how much they pull in out of blood. And the other is how much blood is actually flowing through or to that tissue as well. So those two factors together end up deciding how much oxygen delivery actually occurs. And this makes sense, I think, on the surface value. If you just kind of look at those two things, that makes sense to us. So at rest, both of these factors are pretty constant, but obviously when we're exercising, we need more oxygen delivery to our cells and our working tissues, so that happens. And so what we get is this concept, and we'll start with a diagram, talk about it, and then come back to the diagram, but this idea of atrial mixed venous oxygen difference. It's a bit of a mouthful, but hang tight, and oxygen consumption. So we'll take a peek at this graph, we'll dive into a little bit what it means and then come back to it. But again, if we look at this bottom component of our graph, we see oxygen consumption in liters per minute. So what does that mean? Well, that is how much oxygen is being utilized or taken in by our tissues or cells throughout our entire body. And then on this side, or on our y-axis, we can see it's blood oxygen concentration. So this is talking about how much oxygen is still within the blood at different points in time of our body use of oxygen, or within our blood, right? Okay. To further set the stage here, we see this top line along the top, and what that indicates is the arterial oxygen concentration in blood at the left ventricle. So again, let's pause and think about where the left ventricle is. That is on the left side of our the heart, if we're looking at our own hearts here on the left, but it is the part of the heart, the last chamber, that contracts and pushes blood out throughout the body. So again, fully oxygenated blood, it's been back from the lungs, the pulmonary circulatory system, and is about to be pushed out into the body. So we should hope that it's fully oxygenated, and sure enough, we note that that's always the case. Now, what does this graph start telling us when we dive into this area? Well, there's a difference in oxygen between when we're at rest and the delivery at the tissues, okay? And so what happens is we can see the difference between when our blood first leaves our heart, and then when it returns. And so again, this red line indicates the oxygen content of blood when it returns to the right ventricle. So it's about to go out into the pulmonary circulation. Okay. So what does this tell us? I don't know, it seems a little heady, maybe a little abstract at the moment. Well, when we're looking at this graph, we can see, okay, if I'm at rest, I'm not working very hard, I'm not consuming a lot of oxygen, neither are my cells. And I can see that because there's a very small arterial venous difference. There's not much of a difference, I guess is another way to say it. So my blood is generally speaking very oxygenated. As I start increasing my work rate, so the amount of oxygen that I'm consuming, or my VO consumption in liters per minute, I can see at the higher end when I'm working really, really hard, so 5 liters per minute here, that there's a huge difference between the blood or the oxygen content of blood when it leaves the heart versus when it's about to enter the pulmonary circulation again. Okay, and in essence, that's what this graph depicts. Okay, but it allows us to also see the relationship that after a certain point, we see quite a dramatic drop in oxygen carrying capacity of blood within that first initiation of exercise, and then we get a somewhat of a more level plateau after that. Okay, so atrial venous oxygen difference is just denoted AvO2 diff, and again, that's just the amount of oxygen in the blood before it enters tissue minus the amount that had been taken out by that tissue, so once the blood was leaving. And this obviously increases during exercise, this amount that the tissues will pull out. Remember, we said that was one of the two really important factors as far as seeing what happens with oxygen delivery to tissue, right? It's one of the two really important components. So how much does it get pulled out? And again, as we can see at rest, it's pretty minimal when we're talking about the whole body, and we can see that, at rest it's 5 milliliters of oxygen per 100 milliliters of blood, but at exercise this difference, so the amount that gets pulled out increases about threefold to 15 milliliters of oxygen per 100 milliliters of blood, and that's just the unit of measurement that we have for that. Okay. All right, so that's one aspect of how we deliver oxygen to our bodies and how exercise will kind of change that. So again, more metabolically active tissues will pull more oxygen out of blood, but we also have blood flow. Now, we spoke about this a little bit beforehand, earlier in our discussion, but oxygen delivery, now we can look at the whole equation put together, is blood flow times our AVO difference, right? AVO, again, is atrial venous oxygen blood difference. So the difference between our atrial and our venous oxygen capacity, the amount of oxygen in either of those parts of our body. So with the Fick equation, what we can do is we get to be able to calculate this out and explore the relationships between these terms. So oxygen consumption for the whole body, VO2, is how much oxygen we consume. Again, that's liters per minute in this context. Our cardiac output is blood flow, right? So we spoke about that last. And what was, let's actually write this out. So we have oxygen delivery, which will be in a VO2, so the amount of oxygen utilized times our blood flow times our AVO2 diff. Actually, I want to make those a little clearer. I want to move that over. Okay, so what we can start doing is placing in more terms that we know a bit better. And so blood flow, again, we can think of our cardiac output. How much blood is flowing out of the heart? So that's Q, right? So we have VO2, and we replace our words blood flow with Q. We can times that by our AVO2 diff, so the amount of difference of blood or oxygen that's pulled from the blood from when it leaves the heart to when it returns. And we can start looking at this. So if we increase either our let's go one step further. Okay, so if we think back now, we have our VO2 now that equals, we can split our cardiac output into two other terms, right? We can go heart rate. So Q is heart rate times stroke volume. We can now times that by the difference of oxygen between our arterial and venous blood. And so here we go. So now we can see that there's a lot of different factors that increase essentially our oxygen delivery, right? We can increase heart rate, which would increase our VO2. We could increase our stroke volume, which either of those would increase our cardiac output. Or if the tissues are just pulling in more oxygen out of our blood, that would also increase our VO2. Okay. All right. So that was again two important components in one concept that pulls together a number of different concepts that we've gone through. So cardiac output, as well as our oxygen consumption and how well oxygen delivery occurs within our body. And so what this sets the stage for us as far as understanding the Fick equation and oxygen delivery is we get to dive into a little bit more of things that can influence blood flow. Okay, in particular, we're going to look at how that blood flow gets redistributed throughout the body once we start exercising. Okay.